Hello, my name is Brian Quinn. I'm a technical director on the ServiceNow product success team with a focus on our cloud products. And today we're going to wrap up our three-part series on AWS Credential-less cloud discovery setup. Today's focus is going to be on member account setup. Before we get started, a quick safe harbor notice. I may make some forward-looking statements today, but they should be for informational purpose only. They should not be treated as a commitment, and they are subject to change. The agenda for today, we'll start with a brief overview, again reviewing the three main steps for authenticating to all of the member accounts within an AWS organization. Then we'll talk about the AWS configuration for the member account. And then we'll discuss the ServiceNow configuration for the member account. Then we'll do a demo in our live environment. And then we'll wrap things up with a summary at the end. So once again, the three steps for credential-less authentication in an AWS organization. First, the mid will authenticate to the accessor account using the IAM-role that's attached to the EC2 instance. We covered this in part one. Step two is the mid will use cross-AssumeRole to generate temporary credentials for the management account. So this is an AssumeRole from the accessor account to the management account. We covered this setup in part two. And the third step is the mid will use org AssumeRole to generate temporary credentials for each member account. And this is an AssumeRole from the management account to each member account. And that's what we're going to cover today. So again, going back to our diagram, in part one, we covered the accessor account setup with the mid server being installed on an EC2 with a role attached to it. In part two, we covered the management account setup where we created an IAM role with a trust relationship to the accessor account and the role that exists there, in addition to setting up the policies. And today, in part three, we're going to cover the member account setup. So in the member account, we also need an IAM role created, and actually that needs to be created in each of the member accounts. And that role needs a trust relationship to the management account role. So the role that we created in the management account in part two. And we, again, need that read-only access policy or some other policy to enable cloud discovery. So for the AWS configuration, we need to create that IAM role in each of the member accounts. It's going to require the trust relationship to the IAM role in the management account. And like I said, for policy-wise, we need that read-only access policy or some custom policy that gives cloud discovery all of the permissions that it needs. Like I mentioned before in the other sessions, if you are creating the custom IAM policy, the doc site does have an Excel sheet that will lay out exactly what permissions are required for all of the various cloud discovery patterns. So for screenshot from AWS, so under trust relationships, we would have the trust relationship to the principal, which is the role in the management account. So this would be the management account ID and then the role name that we created in the management account. On the permission side, all we need is the one policy, so a little bit simpler than the other two roles that we created in part one and part two. But again, that can be substituted with a custom policy if desired. On the ServiceNow side, there's the AWS org AssumeRole table. And you will create a record in that table, and you will set the access role name to the ARN of the role. The only difference is because this is going to apply to multiple accounts, instead of using the account number, you'll use a wildcard like an asterisk instead of the account number. For the cloud service account field, you'll set that to the management account. And basically what that's saying is that anytime a member of that is underneath that management account, we're doing discovery on it, we will use this record to choose what role to assume. So once that's set up, we'll then go back to the Cloud Discovery workspace. We'll do that refresh data centers again for the management account. This will actually trigger the data center discovery on all the accounts within the organization. In part two, we saw that two data center discovery patterns were successful. It was the management account and the accessor account, because at that point, those are the only two accounts that have been set up. So today when we do it, we would expect all four to come back, because the entire organization is now set up properly. And then finally, we'll complete the creation of the discovery schedule in the Cloud Discovery workspace. And then we'll review the discovery status and take a look at what you should expect to see there. So here's the form for creating the org assume role parameter. Again, we have the access role name where you're going to put in the full ARN. We'll substitute in that asterisk instead of the account number. And then the cloud service account we will set to the management account rather than any of the individual member accounts. A couple of notes here. This configuration does not work if the role has a path in it. Some cloud teams try to organize their roles by putting them in certain paths. So they add an extra path to the ARN. So unfortunately, this configuration does not work if the role in the member accounts has this path. If you are affected by this issue, please submit a support case. Hopefully support will be able to work with you and get a PRB created that will hopefully be addressed in a future release. For AWS GovCloud, this configuration is supported starting in Xanadu patch 3 and should be supported when Washington patch 9 becomes available as well. The workaround in either case, if you have a path in the role in the ARN, or if you are using AWS GovCloud on an earlier ServiceNow version, in both cases, the workaround is to create an org assume role record per member account. So in this case, the ARN and service account fields would both be set to values specific for each of the member accounts. So if you have 10 member accounts in your AWS organization, the workaround would be to create 10 org assume role records, each one pointing to a specific member account and with the ARN specific for that member account. So using the wildcard would not work. You would need the specific account number in that ARN. All right, and now let's move on to a demo. So here we are on the AWS console for one of my member accounts within my AWS demo organization. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to IAM and then to roles, and we're going to create a new role. We're going to use a custom trust policy, and we're going to add a principal, and the principal will be IAM role. And here we're going to use the ARN for the role that we created in the management account in part 2. We'll add the principal. And next. And then for policies, we're going to use the read-only access policy. And that will enable Cloud Discovery to access all of the APIs within this account. And we will give it the role name. And create the role. And that's all that's required in AWS. Now, in most cases, an AWS organization is going to have a lot of member accounts. So you wouldn't want to go in and manually create this role in each of those member accounts. Most AWS teams have methods in place already to push out roles across their entire organization. Might be Terraform, it might just be AWS stack sets. There are multiple ways to kind of push out this role in bulk across the organization. But this role would have to be pushed out across the entire organization. But in this case, I wanted to show creating it manually so you can see what the configuration should look like. And actually what we can do is we can look at the created role. and verify our trust relationship is set properly. So you can see the trust relationship to the role that in the management account, and our permissions are that read-only access policy that we chose. So even after this role has been pushed out across your organization, you can always refer to this to verify that your configuration is correct. All right, and now we'll switch back to our ServiceNow instance to finish up the configuration there. Here we are on our ServiceNow instance, back on the Cloud Discovery workspace. Now, before we click that refresh data centers to run to kick off the data center discovery patterns again, we're going to go to org AssumeRole and find the AWS org AssumeRole parameters module, and we will open that up. And we're going to create a new record. And here we are going to enter the ARN AWS IAM. We're going to use a wildcard for the account number. And then we are going to put in the role name that we just created. And for Cloud Service account, we will choose the management account. Now, one thing to notice, when we had first created the management account and the accessor account, we had given them names of accessor account and management account. When we had done the test account on the management, after doing the management account setup in part 2, all of the names were actually updated to reflect what is actually in AWS. So all of the account names were updated, and they should now match whatever is specified in AWS. But regardless, I'm going to choose the management account since this needs to point to the management account, and click Submit. So now, anytime a new account is created, there is no additional work in ServiceNow that's needed. As long as that new account gets created with that role, this org AssumeRole record with the wildcard automatically will specify what role needs to be assumed when discovering that new account. So no additional configuration is required in ServiceNow anytime you create new AWS accounts, which is the benefit of using this method. If you were to try to use cross AssumeRole for every account, you would have to create new records for each new account. So the org AssumeRole kind of takes that out and replaces it with a single record with a wildcard. All right, jumping back to our Cloud Discovery workspace, we can now do a refresh data centers. And now if we go to Discovery Status, and we look at the most recent refresh data centers, you can see that we had 4 executions of the data center discovery pattern, 1 for each of our accounts, and all 4 were successful this time. So it does look like all of our configuration is correct. So we can move on with finishing the discovery schedule and kicking it off. So I can click Next here. And this option is for doing horizontal discovery of virtual machines after Cloud Discovery is finished. I do not have that set up, so I'm going to disable that for now. And then finally choosing when this discovery should run. I'll leave this as daily. I'm going to change this to, let's change it to 3 a.m. And finish and run. We'll kick off that discovery schedule right now. Now that the discovery status is running, we can monitor it through the Cloud Discovery workspace or through the standard discovery status module. I'm actually going to move over to the discovery status module because it'll be easier to show a couple things that I want to look at once this discovery finishes. So we will open up the discovery status. And this will take a little while to run. My organization is fairly small, so it won't take more than a few minutes. But depending on the size of your organization, this could take upwards of a few hours for really large organizations. It also is heavily dependent on how many mid servers you have. as well as how large your ServiceNow instance is. Once this discovery status finishes, we'll come back and take a look at some of the log entries, as well as some of the things on the ECC queue, just to keep an eye out for when you're running this in your instance. Now that the discovery run is complete, let's go ahead and just reload this page to make sure everything is up to date and the logs and the ECC queue entries. All right. First thing I want to look at is the discovery log. So some of the cloud discovery patterns are dependent on each other. So they'll run in a series, and if one of the early patterns fails, then the subsequent patterns aren't executed. So the first one I like to look at is the sub-account pattern. So this is getting a list of all the sub-accounts in the AWS organization and then determining what data center patterns to launch based on the number of accounts that there are. So if this pattern fails, most likely there is an issue with your permissions to access the management account. And this would then subsequently prevent a lot of the other patterns from firing. So this is always a good pattern to check. The other pattern that I like to check is data center discovery. Just like the data center discovery from the Cloud Discovery Workspace, we should be seeing one per account in the organization. So in this case, my organization has the 4 accounts. So we do see the 4 data center discovery patterns being launched. And we do expect this to be successful and have no errors for any of these accounts, since we configured everything, all the member accounts, and we configured the org AssumeRole module. So if you are seeing some of your accounts failing when looking at these data center discovery entries, then those individual member accounts probably have a misconfiguration with the role or the trust relationship of the role. So I would go review the role on those member accounts to find out what might be broken. In addition, looking at the mid-server logs will sometimes give you some information on what the error might be. So that's a good source to look at if you are seeing errors. Once the data center discovery pattern is complete, they will trigger subsequent patterns. So if you just do a star LP, most of these LP patterns have a parent of that discovery data center pattern. So for every data center that the data center discovery pattern finds, it will launch one of these LP patterns. So in this case, I have 18 regions active for my AWS accounts. So for each of these patterns, I should see 18 entries. And this is probably easiest to look on the ECC queue. So if I go over to the ECC queue and I search for name contains virtual server, and we look at just the output record, you can see we triggered 72 patterns for the virtual server. That's because for my 4 accounts, 18 regions per account, that would be the 72. Now that we've seen that the sub-account pattern is working and we have the right number of data center discovery patterns launched and they were successful, and we have the right number of virtual server patterns that were launched, we can also look at the devices tab, and I like to filter out the hardware type records. And we should see a list of a lot of the different resources that do exist in our AWS accounts. So you should see things like cloud subnets, the generic cloud resources, virtual server should be in here somewhere in the list. So this gives you a good indication that a lot of the patterns are returning data and properly populating the CMDB. So then now that our CMDB is being populated correctly, I think that's the end of our demo. So let's jump over to the summary before we wrap things up. Let's cover the 3 steps for credential-less authentication in an AWS organization one last time. Step 1 is the mid-server will authenticate to the accessor account using the IAM role that's attached to the EC2 instance where the mid-server is running. We covered this in part 1. The second step is the mid-server will use cross-assume role to generate temporary credentials for the management account. So this is an accessor account to management account AssumeRole. We cover this setup in part 2. And finally, the third step is the mid will use org AssumeRole to generate temporary credentials for each member account. And this is a management account to member account AssumeRole. And that's what we covered in this session. So in AWS, we covered the creation of an IAM role and configuring the trust relationship to the IAM role that is created in the management account. And we also covered attaching the IAM policy to enable cloud discovery in the member account. This IAM role does have to be created in all of the member accounts within the AWS organization. Most AWS teams already have methods in place for pushing these types of roles out across the organization. Sometimes this might be Terraform, it might be AWS stack sets. There are multiple ways of accomplishing this. So you should work with your AWS team to determine the best way to push this role out to all of the accounts in the organization. And then within ServiceNow, we do need to create an org assume role record to specify what role we're going to assume for all of the member accounts. So to do this, we created that org assume role record using the ARN of the role that is created in the member account, but we used a wildcard instead of the account number so that it can apply to all of the accounts within the organization. Once that was set up, we used the Cloud Discovery workspace to complete the discovery schedule and to run it. And then we reviewed some of the key patterns to look for to verify your authentication is working as expected. Thank you for joining me for these 3 sessions. Hopefully the information that I covered in these sessions will help you implement AWS Cloud Discovery using a credential-less authentication for your AWS organization.